My wife died on a Tuesday. By Friday, my son had legal documents on my kitchen table. By the following Monday, I was apartment hunting on Kijiji. I was 67 years old. I had built things with my hands for 38 years. I had put both of my children through university, and they handed me a folder and told me to find a room. I want to tell you what happened next, because 4 months later, in the baking aisle of a grocery store at 7 in the morning, a woman I had never seen before said my father's name and started to cry. And nothing has been the same since. Claire passed away on a February Tuesday, the kind of cold, gray Tuesday that Ontario does better than anywhere else in the world. Pancreatic cancer, 4 months from diagnosis to the end. I sat beside her in the palliative ward at St. Joseph's, holding her hand until it went cold. Then I drove home alone on the 403 through a snowfall that didn't care what had just happened to me. My children came for the funeral, Melissa and Derek. They cried at the graveside the way you cry when you know people are watching. On the 4th morning, before I'd even made coffee, Derek sat me down at my own kitchen table with a folder in his hand. Claire had changed her will 8 months before she died. I hadn't known. She had left her half of the house to Derek and Melissa jointly. Derek told me this calmly, like he was reading from a bus schedule. I asked him where he expected me to go. Melissa from the doorway said I could rent a room somewhere. She said she'd help me look on Kijiji. She said it with genuine kindness in her voice, which somehow made it worse. 2 weeks later, I moved into a bachelor apartment on Barton Street. The carpet smelled like the previous tenant's cigarettes had been sealed inside the walls since 2009. My rent was $950 a month. My pension and CPP together came to $1,400. That left $450 for food, medication, transit, and everything else. I took a night security job at a distribution warehouse on the East Mountain. 12-hour shifts, 4 nights a week, walking the perimeter of a building the size of a city block in the January cold. My right knee, the one I'd had surgery on in 2018, ached from the 2nd hour onward. By hour 8, I was walking with a limp I couldn't hide. But the warehouse paid $13.40 an hour. That was the difference between eating properly and not. I started baking my own bread to save money. I bought ibuprofen in bulk. I worked Christmas Eve and drove home at 4 in the morning and sat alone in that apartment with a cup of instant coffee and a photograph of Claire. I did not receive a single message from my children that night. Not one. One Thursday in late April, I stopped at the Metro on my way home from an overnight shift. I needed bread and margarine and whatever was on markdown. I was in the baking aisle, comparing the price of name-brand flour to store-brand flour, when I became aware that someone was looking at me. I turned around. She was a small woman, very old, 80, perhaps older. White hair, cut short and careful, eyes a pale, almost transparent gray. Immaculately dressed in a camel-colored wool coat, holding a carved wooden cane. She was staring at my face like someone had hit a switch inside her and she'd frozen mid-step. I thought I was standing in front of something she needed. I stepped aside and asked if she was all right. She didn't move. She kept staring at me and said, very quietly, "What is your last name?" I told her, "Gagnon, Walter Gagnon." Her hand tightened on the cane, her mouth opened slightly, then closed. She looked like she was trying to remember how to breathe. Then she said, very carefully, as though the words were expensive, "Did you have a father named Raymond?" The baking aisle of a Metro grocery store at 7 in the morning is not a place where you expect the world to rearrange itself. But that is exactly what happened. Her name was Edna Whitmore. She asked me to follow her car to an office in Dundas, 20 minutes west. I drove behind a dark green Mercedes that moved through traffic at a pace that suggested its driver had no interest in hurrying through what remained of her life. Her office building had the quiet, expensive smell of a place where actual decisions get made. On her desk was a framed photograph, black and white, slightly faded. a young woman in a winter coat standing outside a small rented commercial space. Beside her, one hand on her shoulder, was a man I recognized immediately. Young, maybe 35, his face thinner than I remembered it, but the eyes the same, the set of the jaw the same. My father. I put the photograph down because my hands had started to shake. Then, Edna told me the story.
She was 24 years old, Ukrainian immigrant, in Canada for 3 years. She wanted to open a bakery. She had a location, suppliers, a business plan written out by hand in careful English, revised 16 times. She'd been rejected by 4 different banks. She was young. She was an immigrant. She was a woman. She had no collateral. One loan officer told her with complete sincerity that perhaps she should consider working for an established business instead of trying to run her own. She was on a bus on a January evening heading home from her 5th rejection when a water main broke on King Street and the bus stopped for over an hour. The man across the aisle, reading a union newsletter, looked up and asked if she was all right. She said she was fine. He said gently that she didn't look fine. She started crying. She was 24 and exhausted, and sometimes a stranger's simple observation is enough. My father bought her a coffee at a nearby diner while they waited for the route to clear. He listened to the whole story, the banks, the rejections, the plan she'd worked on for 2 years. He didn't offer advice. He didn't explain the finance industry to her. He listened the way my father always listened, completely, as though nothing you said would be wasted on him. Then he told her he had savings, $22,000 in a CIBC account on James Street, money he'd been putting away for 15 years to eventually buy a small property. He asked her how much she needed to really get started. She told him $18,000. He didn't flinch. He looked out the diner window, then he looked back at her and said he would give her 18. She told him he didn't know her. She told him she might fail, that most small businesses fail, that she might lose everything he gave her and never be able to repay it. My father said that was a possibility, yes. He said he didn't think she would fail. He said she had the look of someone who understood that hard things were supposed to be hard and wasn't frightened by that. He said he wanted a formal agreement. 25% of the company, whatever it became, would be his. If the business failed, she owed him nothing. If it succeeded, he was a partner. They wrote the agreement on a paper playmat, 2 signatures, the date, a handshake. My father withdrew the money the following Monday morning. Edna opened Whitmore Bakery 6 weeks later on a side street in Dundas. 400 square feet, 4 kinds of bread, 1 kind of pastry, 18 hours a day. The following spring, she went looking for my father to give him his first dividend check, $412, because she was already turning a profit and she had made a promise. She went to the address he'd given her. The family had moved. A neighbor said the Gagnons had gone to Sudbury for work, no forwarding address. This was 1972. There was no internet, no way to search. Edna hired a private detective in 1978. He found records of a Raymond Gagnon returning to Hamilton in 1975, then nothing. A second search in 1986 found nothing. A third in 1994 found a Raymond Gagnon in the Hamilton area, but the man died before contact could be made. She received the news 2 weeks after his funeral. She had never stopped looking.
She kept his share of the company intact all those decades, never selling it, never dissolving it, setting aside his dividends in a separate account, because they were not hers. The company had grown to 41 locations across Ontario and Western Quebec, hotel chains, grocery distributors, 5 provinces. She reached into a drawer and laid a folder on the desk. Inside, the original playmat agreement, laminated, the ink still legible, share certificates in the name of Raymond Gagnon, and a financial statement, current as of that March, showing the accumulated value of his 25% stake plus 37 years of reinvested dividends held in trust. The number on that page made me grip the edge of the desk.
$28,400,000. I read it 3 times. I said it aloud, quietly, just to be sure. 3 days after my bank confirmed the deposit of $40,000, the interim payment Edna's lawyer had arranged, I received a call from Derek. I hadn't spoken to him in nearly 4 months. His voice was careful, slightly too cheerful, the voice of a person who has rehearsed. He said he and Melissa had been thinking that perhaps they'd been a bit hasty after Mom's passing, that it was a stressful time for everyone, that maybe decisions had been made that weren't fully thought through. He said they'd both been feeling guilty and wanted to make it right. I asked him what making it right looked like in his mind. He said Melissa had a finished basement, separate entrance, its own bathroom. He said I could live there, nominal rent, nothing significant, and at least we'd all see each other more. He said it would be good for all of us. I sat very quietly with the phone to my ear. I thought about November, January, February, March, the warehouse parking lot at 3 in the morning, the ibuprofen I bought in bulk, the bread I baked to save money, the birthday that passed without a single message. I told Derek I appreciated the offer, but I had found a suitable place and was doing fine. There was a pause. He asked what I meant by suitable, given my financial situation. I told him I'd had some changes recently and was actually quite well. I said I'd prefer to tell them both in person. We agreed on dinner the following Saturday. Derek picked the restaurant. Ancaster, which told me something. He'd already revised his assumptions about my circumstances. They were already seated when I arrived. Melissa noticed my new coat, my new shoes, the fresh haircut. She didn't say anything, but I saw her take it in. We ordered. The conversation was careful and surface level for the first 15 minutes. Then Derek put down his fork and said they genuinely missed me.
I looked at both of them. My daughter, who I had taught to ride a bike on Aldridge Street when she was 6 years old. My son, who I had coached through every apprenticeship application and called every week during his first year living alone in Toronto. And I told them everything. Edna, the grocery store aisle, the photograph, the diner on King Street in 1971, the $18,000, the playmat, the bakery that became 41 locations, the share certificate sitting in a company safe for 53 years, the $28 million. The silence that followed was the loudest I'd heard in a long time. Melissa's face did several things in sequence that I won't describe in detail. Derek recovered faster. He said we were going to have to figure out how to handle this properly, that this kind of money needed careful management, that he knew a wealth advisor, someone his firm worked with, and maybe we could all sit down together and think through how best to structure things. As a family. I picked up my water glass and took a drink. Then I said there was something I needed them to understand before we went any further. I said that when Derek sat me down at my own kitchen table, 11 days after I buried my wife, and handed me legal documents saying I had to leave the house I'd lived in for 22 years, I did not have a single person to call. I said I moved into a room on Barton Street that smelled like cigarettes from a previous decade. I said I took a security job, walking an unheated warehouse 4 nights a week because I could not afford my medication and groceries at the same time. I bought a used coat from a donation shop. I said I ate a lot of beans on toast because it was filling and cheap. I said I worked my first Christmas Eve shift at the warehouse and drove home at 4 in the morning and sat in my apartment with a cup of instant coffee and a photograph of their mother, and did not receive a single message from either of them. Not one. I said I was not telling them this to punish them. I was telling them because they should know what those months had actually been. Not an abstraction, not Dad's tough patch, what it actually was. Melissa's eyes filled with tears. She said she was sorry, that if they'd known how bad it had gotten. I said they had known. They had chosen not to know. There's a difference. Derek said families make mistakes, that no one is perfect. He said it with the tone of someone who believes acknowledging imperfection is the same as addressing it.
I told him I wasn't there to reconcile over a restaurant dinner or discuss wealth management strategies. I was there because they were my children, and I believed in honesty. And the honest thing to say was this: the money was mine. It would remain mine. I would decide what to do with it. And that decision would not include rewarding either of them for 4 months of treating their father like a problem that had been adequately solved. Melissa said she loved me, that she wanted her father back. I hoped that was true.
I told her that if she meant it, it would show over time. Actions are the only currency I trust anymore, and she had a debt in that currency that had nothing to do with money. I paid for my meal when the bill came. I told them both I loved them. Then I left. My father's name was Raymond Gangen. He was a mill worker for 31 years. He never owned property. He patched his own roof. He wore the same winter boots for 6 years because they still had good soles. He sat at the kitchen table in the evenings and did crosswords and watched the news and drank his tea. He never once mentioned to me or my mother or anyone that he had a stake in a bakery empire growing across Ontario. When I asked Edna why he'd never come forward, the company was known in Hamilton. He must have seen the Whitmore Bakery name on storefronts over the years. She was quiet for a moment. Then she said she'd thought about it for decades and had arrived at an answer she believed was probably true. My father, she said, had not given her that money as an investment. He had given it as help. The formality, the percentages, the agreement, that had been her idea. Her pride required it to be a transaction, not charity. But she suspected that once she was on her feet, the thing was simply done in his mind. He had helped someone who needed it. She was no longer in trouble. He could move on. She thought the accounting of it, the repayment, the partnership, probably mattered far less to him than she'd ever understood. She said she thought he was simply that kind of person, the kind who helped without keeping score. About 6 weeks after the transfer completed, I called Thomas, Edna's solicitor, and told him what I wanted to do. I kept enough to live well for the rest of my life, a house, some travel, the kind my father never got to do, a small workshop where I could do finish carpentry again, not for income, but because I'd spent 38 years with my hands in that craft, and I missed the smell of raw wood. The larger portion, approximately $14 million, I directed into a foundation, the Raymond Gangen Foundation. Its purpose? To provide bridge financing and support for immigrants and newcomers in Canada attempting to establish small businesses. People being told no by banks for the same reasons Edna was told no in 1971. People with a plan and a work ethic and nowhere to take them. I asked Edna if she would agree to be on the advisory board. She said she thought that was the most sensible thing she'd ever heard, and that Raymond would have considered it an enormous waste of resources. She said it with the particular affection of someone who understood exactly what she meant by it. My father died in his vegetable garden on a Sunday morning in August. He was 64. I found him there. He died not knowing that the $18,000 he gave a stranger on a bus in 1971 had become something that would outlast him by decades and find his son in a grocery store aisle when that son had nothing left. He didn't leave me money, not really. He left me an example. A man who saw someone in trouble and didn't calculate the cost of helping, who wrote a promise on a paper plaque mat and trusted it to hold, who did the right thing because it was right, and then went home, went back to the mill, and never mentioned it to anyone. The tomatoes I planted in the backyard this summer came in beautifully. I made sauce from scratch for the first time in my life. It tasted, improbably, exactly like something I'd had before and almost forgotten. My father used to say that the things you plant in good faith tend to come up in their own time. He said it about gardens. He said it about people, too. He was right about most things he bothered to notice. If this story stayed with you, leave a comment. Tell me where you're listening from. And if you knew someone like Raymond Gangen, Someone who gave without keeping score. Tell me about them, because the world needs to know those people existed.